Hey everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you another horror and thriller dark fiction wrap-up. And today I'm going to talk about all the books I read recently, a combination of new releases and backlist. And basically I did the thing where I got really fixated on one topic and I read several books along the lines. I basically just binged through a whole bunch of books and I read them until I kind of got sick of the topic. I don't know if anyone else does that, where they kind of get into one thing and then they just read the same type of book over and over again. Let me know if I'm not alone, but I'm here to share with you all my latest book binge. All that being said, let's get started. Alright, let's start with the book that started that binge, and that was this new release of Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. And this is a story that follows a Cree woman who is having these very vivid, lucid dreams. In the dreams, she sees these crows, and there is meaning and imagery behind what she's seeing. And so when she wakes up, at first, she actually believes that her dreams possibly are real. She goes out to reach out to her Cree family and explore if there's more going on. This essentially turns into a horror story that goes from there. But I will say that while it is labeled as a horror story, it definitely leans more into suspense in the fact that it's more about the build-up than a really crazy ending. And instead, I would say it's very slow paced, it's very character driven. My favorite part about it is the indigenous cultural aspects to the story and the inclusion of family dynamics within there. I am someone who has always worked very closely with the indigenous people of Canada, and the fact that this story is written by a Cree woman herself from Canada really rang true. I really love to have that own voice's perspective, and it's just a topic that I personally love to read again and again, as you will see in this video. And so I was very excited for this one. High hopes. It was one of my most anticipated releases. I'll say that I love the cultural elements, but I'll be honest, I was a little bit let down by the story. I did like the setup, the dream sequences. It was very atmospheric and slow burning. The characters were well developed, but the plot took a long time to get going and it never really launched off. And again, it was more the suspense than the actual horror. The climax was just a little bit lacking for me, so I did want more from this book, but I don't know if it's the fact that the book let me down or if my expectations were just too high. Either way, if you love Indigenous fiction as much as I do, you still probably want to check this one out. I did really enjoy it overall. Next is Never Name the Dead by D.M. Rowell, and this is a story that follows a young Native American woman who has left her reservation and gone away. However, she is called back by her grandfather. He is very mysterious when he calls her back, and then she gets pulled into a larger story. This is a case where, once again, I really did like the cultural elements to the story, but I will admit that I do have a preference for Canadian Indigenous stories just because the experience here is a little bit different than in the States. Certainly there's similarities, there's lots of crossover, but I do notice those differences, so I don't quite connect as much. In terms of the story and plot itself, there's a reason I was so vague in the synopsis, is that I was really underwhelmed by it. I felt like not a lot happened. I found myself getting really bored by the story. And I feel like it's a story that if it was just a mystery and you pulled out all the cultural elements, it would be really dry. That was pretty much the only thing going for the story. And I do think that a good mystery has to hold its own, and then the cultural aspects of the story should just be something on top of that, instead of the only thing kind of holding the story together. So I was kind of let down. I was pretty bored. Next up is Cold Mourning by Brenda Chapman, and this story follows a community where a wealthy gentleman goes missing and is possibly dead, and so the police are sent to investigate. We follow a young officer who is known as Stonechild. They are of Indigenous descent, and they're investigating this story. This is one that I like because I do enjoy, once again, those cultural elements that get pulled into it. Can I say that enough? And this one definitely plays a lot with family dynamics, complicated family relationships, which is something that's kind of become a buzzword for me, as I like really messy families, and this one is really messy. You have burnt connections and just falling outs and all of that feels very reminiscent of not any culture in particular. I think it's relatable to everyone. I also like that this one is set in the Canadian winter, and so it's very atmospheric and wintry and has that kind of cold feeling to it, so great to read this time of year, at least if you live where I do. And I liked it, but once again, I did find the mystery to be a little bit simplistic, or it just wasn't really the reason that I was reading the story. So I think if you're solely looking for a mystery story, I don't think that this one is very complex or very compelling, but I like the family aspects around it, so it was good, but not great. I feel like my book binge was kind of falling apart at this point. Next is Shudder by Ramona Emerson, and this is a story that follows a young woman of Navajo descent in New Mexico. She works as a forensic photographer, and she also happens to have this supernatural ability to see the dead. And so we follow her as she is investigating a particular crime, and the story goes on from there. This is one where I actually liked it for multiple reasons. So of course, again, Indigenous rep, and it seems to be all I wanted to read these days. but I also really liked that the story itself was compelling. I fully admit I do not love the trope of I see dead people. I'm not actually a fan of supernatural thrillers, so this one technically wasn't up my alley in terms of what I usually enjoy. So the fact that the story worked as well as it did, it really shows how strong the story was. So I really liked that this book involved photography, which is really creepy in and of its own self, which I'll talk about more in a second. But the fact is that it involves a person who works in forensic and then also has this other element. The story takes place in both the past and present, so you get to find out how she grew up with this ability, how it was accepted and dealt with by her family. And it just kind of is woven well into the story. I just felt like the characters were well developed, really fleshed out and dynamic. And at the same time, again, the story and the mystery were actually compelling on their own. And so the fact that the story had diverse, interesting elements beyond that just were gravy on top of the fries, instead of a story where the mystery itself kind of felt hollow. So this one I overall really liked. It was a little bit long for me. Again, I don't love supernatural thrillers, but if that is your jam, if that is your thing, you will probably love this one, because I definitely thought it was better than most. And overall a pretty good read. And next up is Childgrave by Ken Greenhall. And this is more of a vintage horror story that I read with my Patreon book club. Again, if you ever want to join us on Discord, you can check out my link down below and help support the channel, which is always a bonus for me. But in the story, we follow a man who works as a photographer, and within his pictures, he starts to see the image of children. And this ends up drawing him to a small remote community known as Childgrave. And so he goes to investigate what is there, and the story spirals onwards. I do not want to give away the ending, but I will say that it was really fantastic. I'll admit I was kind of slow to warm up to this book. The main character is not likable, and not in a way that he's intentionally unlikable. I just found him to be very flat and annoying, and I just didn't really care about him and his love life. So I wasn't immediately impressed by this book. I wasn't immediately hooked in, but I'm really glad that I had the excuse of the book club to go along for the ride and not be tempted to DNF it early on, because I ended up, really liking it by the ending. It had some good twists and turns that I didn't expect. I haven't read tons of vintage horror, but this is the kind of book that makes me want to read more. Despite what all happens in the book, I would almost describe this book as cozy in tone despite what happens in it. So it almost felt like kind of wrapping myself in this nice woolen blanket, even though, again, terrible things started to happen. But overall, it was, fun by the end. I definitely don't think it's perfect because, again, I'm much more about the journey than the destination when it comes to a book. But a good punchy ending will bring a book up a notch, and that was definitely the case here. And again, there's something just about photography that is just really creepy when you actually think about how you immortalize people in photos and like steal their soul potentially. And so I do love that the author played with that idea. I just wish his main character had been less of a flat, wet blanket. Next is The Echo Man by Sam Holland, and this is a serial killer thriller, even though I promised myself I would give myself a break from reading these stories, but I'm like an addict. I keep going back over and over again, hoping that the next one will be a favorite. In the story, of course, there is a serial killer known as the Echo Man, and we also follow a group of investigators trying to track them down. And then particularly the story is told from the perspective of a woman who is in a very unhappy marriage and through circumstances ends up kind of going on the run. And the story goes from there. I will say the part with the woman felt so unrealistic, over the top, and I struggled to suspend my disbelief. I also struggled to care about her as a character. She again is written to be purposely unlikable. She makes some early choices that will definitely not impress some of the readers. But overall, it just felt like the author was pulling things from left and right and out of nowhere. And in terms of a plot and a cohesive narrative, I didn't really buy it. But I will say, if you're looking for a gruesome serial killer story, this one definitely starts out with a bang, which is kind of the reason I started reading it, because I got really into the start. And it does have some good moments, but at the end of the day, it's a classic serial killer narrative. If you love that, go check it out. If you're tired of reading them, this one might be a miss for you. I probably should have skipped it, but like I said, I can't help myself. I keep reading them and keep thinking that I'm going to get different results, even though I keep going back around and finding the same old story every time. And I also read Sallow Ben by Baxter. This, I believe, is my first time reading anything by this author. Within the story, there is a small town where these girls have gone missing and there's possibly some evil rising within the town. This is like a terribly tropey horror book in the way that it's very predictable. It hits on those points that you would expect. If you are going in looking for those familiar tropes, if you find that very comforting, I think you'll enjoy this one. I liked it for the most part, but I did feel like it went on a little too long. There's a bit too much repetition or over explanation at certain points of time. So I liked it to a degree. I don't think it's the best example of books of this type, but definitely if you're interested in this, if you love stories like this, perhaps you'll enjoy it a little bit more than I did. I was kind of underwhelmed, but I appreciated what I was doing. And I also read the graphic novel of The Ice Cream Man, Volume 8. This is a horror anthology graphic novel I've been reading for years, and as always, I'm going to say that this is so hit or miss. If you have Hoopla through your library, the app, you should be able to download the editions, and I either think these stories are brilliant or they totally miss the mark, which is exactly what happened again in Volume 8. I really love the middle story, which involved testing of psychedelic drugs. It was so psychological and creepy and messed up, and I loved it. The first story I really just didn't get or connect with, and I'll be honest, the last story, while it was emotional, it was just more sad than horrifying, and I just felt it dragged on a little too long. So I do recommend trying this series out because it has some amazing creative gems within it, but as with every short story collection, some are hits and some are misses, and so you just have to know that going into it. But I do cautiously recommend the series because I've had a lot of fun reading the ones that did work for me. And last, I read Winterkill by Ragnar Jónasson, and this is a story that is translated from Icelandic, where the author is from. I've been reading books from this author for quite a while, and this is a series I want to get back to. This is the third book in a series that follows an inspector named Ari, and while you can technically start with this one, I do recommend starting back at the beginning of the series, only because I really love spending time with him as a character. When we first meet him, he is very insecure and anxious, which is just not the kind of personality traits you normally see in a lead investigator of a book series. Normally they're all like cliche and suave, and instead he is just not what you would expect. He definitely doesn't fit a stereotype or a mold, and I really like that. In this book, he's definitely grown a lot, he's matured a lot, and his relationships have advanced in different directions. And within the story, I should mention, there actually is a mystery, which I did find to be compelling. There is a young woman who appears to have fallen off a building, possibly suicide, possibly not. And of course, they are investigating this all over the Easter weekend. And I like the story because while it's set in winter, it's a little bit of a softer winter at the beginning. It's kind of more the snow falling. And I just love the Icelandic atmosphere. Am I the only person in North America who is just dying to go there? It's definitely on my top places I would love to travel to and visit. And so I can't help it. I'm constantly reading this author's books because I just want to picture myself there. Hopefully not in the middle of a murder investigation, don't get me wrong, but I really do want to visit. Normally I don't relate to inspector characters very much, but I just found him to be so incredibly relatable, maybe because I have my own anxieties, and so I really do recommend this to anyone who is looking for that kind of representation. I thought it was so well done. And as my booktube shout out this week, I thought it was a perfect time to shout out the Native Lady Book Warrior channel, and as the title suggests of her channel, she reads a lot of Indigenous work, not just mystery and thrillers, but she definitely does do that. And so I think if you're looking for more Indigenous fiction, obviously I'm on a bit of a book binge myself, but she is another great resource for you and really will give a more well-rounded perspective on all the genres that she reads. So highly recommend her channel. I love getting recommendations from her, and hopefully you'll enjoy her as well. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I'd also love to know, have you ever gone on a book binge where you read one book and then you just wanted more and more, so you kept reading similar books on the topic? And I guess, how did it go for you? I'll be honest, I enjoyed the book binge, but when I actually look back at my recommendations, I don't know if I found a lot of winners. I found a lot of just okay books, which is not what I'm going for when I'm trying to pick up and review books for you all. So we will see what is my next book binge, because despite saying that it wasn't successful, I know I'm going to do it again. It's definitely something I find very addictive, is kind of going down a particular rabbit hole and reading a whole bunch of books on one topic. All that being said, if you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and true crime. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up, share it around online, you can hit that little notification bell so you never miss a video from me, and you can even drop a comment, even if it's just a little emoji, like, I don't know, a stack of books. And otherwise, I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.